A reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 11, starting with verse 15. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "It is not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when the evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. It's the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I was reading some health experts' opinions on the protests and gatherings, and mostly I was wondering how it would affect COVID-19 infection numbers, how long out it would take to see spikes in cases, kind of what does this mean for public health, this unprecedented time of gathering. And I read a lot of support actually for the protests from public health experts, which surprised me a little bit. And most often they kind of highlighted two things. First, any immediate spike cannot be attributed to the protests. So any spike within this week or so, because of the lag time with testing results and symptoms that show up later, so people go and get tested later, we're more likely to see results of the protests on case numbers in about 2, 3, maybe even 4 weeks. Any immediate spike is probably due to relaxed measures, but more importantly, any data we have is hard to kind of source where the infection spikes are coming from because we don't have comprehensive tracing and testing programs in place. And they say any spike we see from any source could have been mitigated by better contact tracing and testing. And two, they say the risk of an African American man dying in the hands of police in their lifetime is 1 in 1,000, which is similar to the mortality rate of COVID-19. Health experts say that the current state of policing in America is a public health crisis. Many of these public health experts support protests not because COVID-19 is a hoax or COVID-19 can spread at a protest or anything like that, but as one public health expert said, and this is my paraphrasing, "Coronavirus is a disease with an end. There will hopefully be a vaccine, and it won't be as deadly or as widespread as it once was, but racism is a chronic disease that gets worse the longer it lasts and the more entrenched it becomes. These protests are about saving lives, as racism is a disease that will last many, many lifetimes." To illustrate this, Ruby Bridges, who was the first black girl to go to a mandated integrated school in the South, she's still alive. She's only 65. To me, what public health experts are saying is that these protests are public health risks, and every precaution should be taken in order to prevent the spread of the disease, but to not have these protests is even more of a public health risk. These protests are addressing what is a very real threat to public health, one that is long-lasting and pervasive through generations. In many ways, it may be bad timing, but in many other ways, there could be no other time. Firstly, because of the urgency of these lives at risk, but also because folks have time to go and protest right now. Cell phones have captured what has been previously hidden, and even then they've only captured a fraction of what the reality of insidious racism and the way it affects people of color. We're in an age of unprecedented fact-checking, as evidenced by videos surfacing which refute public statements made by police officers about their violent conduct. Buffalo police say a protester slipped on the ground, and then video surfaces which shows us that he was pushed. We get feel-good videos of police kneeling with protesters, and then we see the same group of police shooting tear gas into the protesters they were just kneeling with. We have captured on video police breaking Geneva Convention by destroying medical tents, spoiling water, and also plainclothes cops inciting violence in a crowd. You have the video evidence to prove it, but in reality, black folks have been telling us that cops have engaged in these strategies of violence for generations. While I have no doubt in my mind that there are cops who were signed up for the job because they wanted to protect the community and had an honest interest in serving folks, making people feel safe, I also know that when somebody tells me only a few bad apples are doing this, I have to remind them that the rest of the saying is a few bad apples spoil the bunch. What is clear to me is that public safety spending has ballooned, while education and healthcare spending has been cut to ribbons, and I know a lot of people in the public don't feel more safe with the kind of militarism that has been happening. Documents of police recruiting tactics revealed that recruitment intentionally turns away too well-qualified applicants. Police training in our country takes less hours and has more incidents of violence than countries like Norway, Sweden, Germany, and Canada. And it takes less training hours to become a cop than it does to become a barber in most cases. Officers who are charged with crimes or have dozens of excessive use of force citations, if they get fired, often find work at another precinct. There's no national database for this kind of stuff. And I've had more than one veteran say to me that discipline and rules of engagement for a typical police force does not meet the standards used by armed forces. They're embarrassed by the conduct, yet police forces are increasingly being equipped like armed forces. At this point, I don't think police reform is enough. There needs to be a total reimagining of what public safety is, and it's clear to me that a cop armed with a gun is not actually equipped to deal with a public health and safety issue, such as somebody having a psychotic break in the park. A woman once called the cops because her neighbor's door was open in the wee hours of the night, and the cops ended up shooting the homeowner of that house with the door open. Breonna Taylor was asleep in her house when plainclothes officers performed a no-knock raid on her home, shot her, and killed her. They were at the wrong house, and the suspect they were looking for was already in police custody when the raid occurred. And if you listen, if you can bear it, to the boyfriend's 911 call, he had no idea that they were police officers. I just don't think reform is enough. Retraining isn't enough. There needs to be a fundamental change in how we approach public safety. There are pretty clear links to policing as it exists as an institution today and runaway slave catchers. The fact is that policing isn't exactly a politically neutral thing. It has historical roots attached to the ownership of black bodies. And even if policing works to protect social order, America's social order is not equitable and not politically neutral either. When we equip cops with guns, handcuffs, and arrests as their tools, the means of problem solving and escalation will always be violent. Retraining is not enough. Just this week, somebody who did implicit bias training with police officers was shot with a rubber bullet by a police officer, and they specifically aimed at his groin, rupturing his testicle. Retraining is what the Minneapolis police officers did. It is not enough. You can disagree on details, but it's clear to me that something needs to happen. It's clear to the nation that something needs to happen. This is the language of protest. These protests, however, have taken critique for being violent or turning into riots. People will say, the right way to protest is to do it nonviolently. And then they'll use an MLK quote as their example, and they'll say, the protesters lost all credibility for me when they started burning buildings. I disagree. I wish not a single bit of destruction had occurred, but I disagree. These protests have credibility. First, people have peacefully protested police brutality. The most famous example in our recent history being Colin Kaepernick, who was chastised and villainized by a large portion of the country for not protesting the right way. And MLK, who is not the only civil rights figure but seems to be the only one people like to quote, had this to say about riots. I contend that the cry of black power is at bottom a reaction to the reluctance of white power to make the kinds of changes necessary to make justice a reality for the Negro. I think that we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard, and what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. And I'll remind you that while MLK peacefully protested, he was an agitator. He disrupted things. The Montgomery bus boycott was not some toothless boycott of symbolic meaning, but rather it was an economic sanction placed upon the Montgomery bus system to get them to change. It was attacking them where they would listen. And MLK peacefully protested, and MLK was murdered for it. Let us also not forget all the looting and destruction which is being done by white supremacist groups, by folks who are just bored or folks trying to make the protests look bad by stirring up destruction. And many of these protesters don't want a riot. They don't want burning buildings and smashed windows, and they work actively to keep those things from happening. And let us also be reminded that human lives are more valuable than buildings which have insurance and can be rebuilt. But a human life, you can't get that back. But beyond all this, to dismiss the protests outright because of property damage and destruction would be a failure to grapple with the history in our holy book of figures of power and authority continuing their misuse and oppression of other people until some kind of destruction dismantles the very system they were using for that abuse. The story of liberation from slavery for the Israelites in Exodus is one in which Pharaoh is met with great signs, met with a simple plea that the Israelites may perform a sacrifice to the Lord, and Pharaoh refuses to hear. He gives them not 1 inch. So God brings upon Egypt the plagues. Water turns to blood. The rivers and houses are swarmed by frogs. They're swarmed by gnats and flies. Their livestock becomes diseased. They are afflicted with boils. It thunders and hails, ruining their flax and barley. They're afflicted by locusts. There's a thick darkness which covers the land. Their whole way of life is shut down. Crops are ruined, livestock killed, slaves unable to work due to the darkness. They're swarmed by disgusting creatures. These are disruptions to their system, a system which has exploited and abused the Israelite people. It has made them slaves. It's whipped them for not being productive. It's denied them their religious festivals. And sometimes, while these plagues go on, Pharaoh repents. Pharaoh says he's done wrong, but when the plague ends, Pharaoh knows the damage wasn't as bad as it could have been. Pharaoh's heart is hardened again, and he refuses to let the Israelites go. It's in the last plague, the plague in which the firstborn sons are killed, that Pharaoh finally grants the Israelites their leave. The liberation of the Israelites is bought with violence. There are more examples of this kind of stuff in the Old Testament, but you might say to me, Old Testament God was a God of vengeance and violence. Jesus deals with us with injustice differently. Well, first I'd say the Old Testament is part of our book. We need to grapple with it, but I also need to remind you that the righteous fury of Christ was enacted upon the temple in our sermon text. The Gospel of John's telling of this is actually a little more explicit than Mark's. It specifically says that the Passover was near, which means Jews would have been offering sacrifices at the altar. So I guess entrepreneurs set up shop outside the temple, selling animals to be sacrificed. Cattle, sheep, even doves for those who could not afford a premium sacrifice. Moneylenders were present to exchange their currencies into the currencies used to pay temple taxes. What was once a holy temple, a place to encounter God, now becomes a marketplace. The religious rites and rituals of the Jews had been commoditized to turn a profit. An economy was made out of the Jews' attempt to live their life. Jesus destroys the system of exchange which was exploiting the Jews. He drives out the animals, empties the coin purses, flips the table. He destroys the property. In essence, is destroying the system which profits off of the back of the Jewish people who are trying to do the religious observances. The destruction of the temple marketplace in Mark comes after Jesus has been healing, teaching, peacefully restoring people to wholeness, teaching them what it means to encounter God. Make no mistake that Mark places Jesus' destruction of the temple marketplace only a couple of days before his arrest, trial, and crucifixion. They were trying to kill him because he disturbed the system of economics. When power refuses to listen, refuses to change, the language of the unheard becomes riotous. I wish for not one more cent of property damage, especially for those who really need that income, small businesses, to be done. But I also understand the fires represent the will of a people to burn down economic systems, political systems, and justice systems which have kneeled on the necks of black bodies and built wealth off of their dead backs. The fires are meant to burn down the systems that burned down Black Wall Street. They're meant to burn down the systems that cleared a black community to make Central Park, the systems which gentrify black neighborhoods and constantly work to overshadow and undo black excellence. Much like Jesus cleansed the marketplace and the temple, these fires are a shout to cleanse our communities from the idols of profit, militarism, and white supremacy. As James Baldwin wrote in the aptly named The Fire Next Time, why would I want to integrate into a burning house? And this question is brought up, why would you destroy your own community? Aren't you hurting your own people? So often the answer is, this isn't our community. We can't invest in it. We don't own anything in it. We are sequestered, and every part of our life here is commoditized. We're policed with an iron fist, and we're killed here. We can't live here. Things need to be metaphorically and literally torn down before we can be invested and rooted here. Why would we want to integrate into a burning house? Now, biblically, after the disruption of Egypt through the plagues, after the destruction of the temple marketplace by Jesus, after the flooding of earth by God, the result's not reform. The economic systems of Egypt aren't realigned so that the Israelite slaves can have some festivals off. The marketplace and the temple doesn't start lowering their prices so poor folk can more easily afford a dove to sacrifice. The earth isn't flooded so half of the folks can remain and do the same things they were doing before, but try again. After the biblical destruction, the result is not reform, but it's recreation. The Israelites are liberated from their captivity. The temple is destroyed and takes on a different life, and we as Christians know the role of Christ and sacrifice entirely differently now. The covenant between humans and God is made totally anew as God makes God's promise to Noah. While we assuredly do not want fires and damage, we also want human life to be valued and for justice to flow like water. What the fires should tell us, especially us white Christians, no matter our feelings on them, is that we cannot force integration into a burning house. We cannot reform the system that has been built to put its knees on the necks of black folks. Instead, we have to build the beloved community together. Amen.